Okay, so what in Carcosa is the prophet's paradise? I mean, just listen to this. The clown turned his powdered face to the mirror. If to be fair is to be beautiful, he said, who can compare with me in my white mask? Who can compare with him in his white mask? I asked of Death beside me. Who can compare with me, said Death, for I am paler still. You are very beautiful, sighed the clown, turning his powdered face from the mirror. This story, if you can call it that, falls just about at the heart of The King in Yellow, right around the point where the paranormal elements of the collection are starting to fade away and are gradually being supplanted by the historical romantic drama pieces that I've mocked in my previous installments. This story is actually arguably the last in which anything overtly supernatural happens. The story that follows it, The Street of the Four Winds, does involve a guy Frenching a corpse, but that's not technically paranormal. The Prophet's Paradise raises a lot of questions for people reading The King in Yellow front to back. Is this one story, or more like 8 disconnected stories? Are these stories at all, or maybe prose poems? And what do they, regardless of their quantity, form, or genre, have to do with the broader Yellow mythos? Let's get into it. So first, the form. The Prophet's Paradise is made up of 8 discrete scenes, none of which follows chronologically from the previous. The 8 sections of the piece are titled, in order of appearance, The Studio, The Phantom, The Sacrifice, Destiny, The Throng, The Jester, The Green Room, and The Love Test. Elsewhere, I've seen people argue about whether these are prose poems or short microfiction pieces, but I honestly don't really want to get caught up in litigating genre because A, the genres of microfiction and prose poetry aren't necessarily even mutually exclusive, and B, it matters a whole lot less than the contents of these 8 episodes say. I think it's just a lot more useful to try to describe rather than to label the Prophet's Paradise. With that in mind, here are some things that we can pretty definitively say about each piece. Each of these stories is narrated in the first person by what is the same narrator. We can tell that it's the same guy by his consistent tone, vernacular, and obsessions, which we'll get into very shortly. Each episode is also quite concise and what we might call in the poetry world an emotionally intense utterance, so there are elements of poetry to them, for sure. Something else that's a little bit poetry-like is that each piece of the Prophet's Paradise spells basically nothing at all out for the reader. These stories anticipate our ability to read between the lines and decipher layers upon layers of metaphor. And each of these stories also makes use of refrains and variations on those refrains in order to create sort of a dreamlike, or maybe more accurately, nightmare-like atmosphere. The contents of each piece also add to this overall feeling. The title of the sequence, The Prophet's Paradise, is drawn from the epigraph, which reads, If but the vine and love abjuring band are in the Prophet's Paradise to stand, alack, I doubt the Prophet's Paradise were empty as the hollow of one's hand. This quatrain, which comes from the world-famous Persian poem The Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, basically says, if only those who abstain from love and desire are given access to paradise, then paradise is most likely empty. Without getting off into the weeds about the Rubaiyat and its history, we can think of this quatrain as kind of a distillation of the Prophet's Paradise's central question. That being, is the claim made by this quatrain true? Does passionate love preclude one from accessing paradise? And must one choose between the two? The thing about the Prophet's Paradise is that it's so disjointed that it's nigh impossible to actually summarize. I'm gonna try, but first I'm gonna read the first section, The Studio, in its entirety, so that between that and the sampling that I read earlier, you kind of have a sense of what it feels like to read this and why it's so hard to sum up in terms more concise than it already provides. Here's The Studio. He smiled, saying, "Seek her throughout the world." I said, "Why tell me of the world? My world is here between these walls and the sheet of glass above, here among gilded flagons and dull jeweled arms, tarnished frames and canvases, black chests and high-backed chairs, quaintly carved and stained in blue and gold. "For whom do you wait?" he said, and I answered, "When she comes, I shall know her." On my hearth, a tongue of flame whispered secrets to the whitening ashes. In the street below, I heard footsteps, a voice, and a song. "For whom do you wait?" he said, and I answered, "I shall know her." Footsteps, a voice, and a song in the street below, and I knew the song, but neither the steps nor the voice. "Fool," he cried, "the song is the same. The voice and steps have but changed with years." On the hearth, a tongue of flame whispered above the whitening ashes, "Wait no more, they have passed, the steps and the voice in the street below." Then he smiled, saying, "For whom do you wait? Seek her throughout the world." I answered, "My world is here, between these walls and the sheet of glass above, here among gilded flagons and dull jeweled arms, tarnished frames and canvases, black chests and high-backed chairs, quaintly carved and stained in blue and gold." So what do we have here? As in other stories in The King in Yellow, the protagonist, our narrator, seems to be an artist, one who has cloistered himself in his studio among the products of his craft, rather than do what this disembodied voice suggests and seek love within the outside world. The objects in the studio, I think it's safe to say, are imitations of what the speaker wants more deeply, this romantic connection. This isn't to say that I think he secretly dislikes art or something like that, just that the art is being used to sublimate a deeper desire. He creates beautiful things which perhaps can't reject him as the woman singing outside his window might. Over the course of the story, it seems that a really great swath of time passes all at once during that moment when the speaker stops recognizing the voice and the footsteps in the street below. To me, this signals that the situation for the speaker has suddenly become very dire. The narrator ages, and he's running out of time to find true love. In the end, he refuses, the call of destiny, as it were, choosing to remain in his studio, foolishly insisting that when love comes, he will know that it's time to leave. Rather than move forward in time, the second story, The Phantom, actually takes us to the narrator's past. The narrator wrestles with this entity called the Phantom of the Past, who is probably an embodiment of memory. If that sounds confusing, think about it this way. When the past is gone, what remains of it? Well, memories of it, right? Memories that are not the past itself, but are reflections or echoes or phantoms. So in the scene, the narrator and memory are walking somewhere together, but memory suddenly just stops and refuses to go any further. The narrator tries to physically force her to continue along, but she is able to fend him off. From this, we can glean that the speaker is conflicted about some recollection or another. He wants to recall that thing, but his mind refuses to allow him to go there. The male speaker putting his hands on a feminine-gendered memory might invite modern readers to think that the speaker has done something really horrifically violent, but I'm skeptical as to whether or not that's what Chambers maybe intended. In the romantic tradition that Chambers was writing in, embodied concepts like victory, fate, or indeed memory were feminine by default, so I think it's more likely that we're meant to just read this straight. The speaker is just wrestling with memory, gender politics aside. This is definitely disturbing and problematic still, sure, and it wouldn't play in a modern version of the story, but I don't want us to think from this encounter that the narrator is like an evil murderer or something, because I think that draws in unnecessary complications that are ultimately going to make the story harder to understand and guide us away from what it's really trying to tell us. Moving along, in The Sacrifice, the narrator watches a woman who is mourning the death of a lover that she has killed, in a metaphorical sense, water flowers with his blood. So the narrator is following her from a distance, and he notices that the jar that she is carrying is inscribed with a ton of names. Meanwhile, the flowers that she's watering are white, and they have these, quote, hearts of gold. So clearly the jar represents some kind of heartbreak. This woman, or maybe women more generally, has broken a lot of hearts, says the story. The flowers, meanwhile, are a little bit more complicated. I think that they likely represent true love, which is a concept that's often characterized as pure and associated with the color white, at least in romantic literature. So taken together, The woman has broken many men's hearts, but her doing so has allowed her to maintain her purity, a goal with which the story sort of regretfully sympathizes. In the next piece, Destiny, the speaker comes across a bridge that he tells us only very few people are ever allowed to cross. He, however, is immediately given access, and instead of crossing, he watches for a long, long time as people arrive at the bridge and are turned away, but instead of leaving, sort of throng up at the entrance of it. Eventually, he decides that he's ready to cross, and though the crowd mocks and jeers him, he crosses without issue and watches as the gate on the far side closes behind him. Interestingly, the next section, which is titled The Throng, refers to a word that appeared in the previous section. This is part of why I initially was cued in to read The Prophet's Paradise as a contiguous piece, rather than as a sequence of disjointed or unrelated metaphors. The Throng makes this connection very explicit, but as we've already started to see, subtler thematic echoes also make the connection pretty apparent. Anyway, in The Throng, the narrator is... this is weird, but he's tricked by a clown into thinking truth, as in capital T, truth, has stolen from him and must therefore be arrested. The way that we arrive at this point where the narrator is standing in the town square demanding that truth be brought to justice is kind of complicated and not really worth summarizing. It's more important that we understand that this is what happens. The narrator ends up looking like a fool, demanding that truth, a thing that cannot do wrong, has done him wrong. Following this, we have another piece about a clown titled The Jester. Here, a jester tells a story in which a young man, after being away for a long time on this really perilous quest, returns home to find that his brother and his lover have actually gotten together. He says, "Stabbed, she kissed him at the gate, but in the hall his brother's welcome touched his heart." The narrator repeatedly interrupts the jester's story to ask, "Was she fair?" referring to the lover. The narrator seems to have this desperate need to assess the damage of the betrayal. He's wondering, did the protagonist of the jester's story lose out on being with the love of his life? Or was this woman faithful from the start? It's sort of, was she fair or was she fair in two senses simultaneously? We then have yet another clown story, The Green Room, which I read at the very beginning. In this one, Death, the narrator, and a clown are all standing in a room arguing about who is more beautiful, Death or the clown. Death ultimately wins the argument on the basis that the clown insists that being pale is beautiful, Death says he is the most pale, therefore he is the most beautiful by default. The reason that I say that this is the one that contains a supernatural element is because of the physical presence of Death. This piece also might remind us of the epigraph of the second story in The King in Yellow, The Mask, in which something that seems too horrible to be true, in fact, is. Likewise, death is itself that undeniable but hideous truth in this story. Death, which will take away all beauty in time, is itself the most beautiful. Finally, we have the eighth and final section, the love test. Since it's the last one and it's short, I'll read this one aloud as well. "If it is true that you love," said Love, "then wait no longer. Give her these jewels which would dishonor her and so dishonor you in loving one dishonored. If it is true that you love," said Love, "then wait no longer. I took the jewels and went to her, but she trod upon them, sobbing, 'Teach me to wait. I love you. Then wait, if it is true,' said Love." So in this story, Love challenges a man to give his lover some jewels, prove that your love is true, by giving her a gift that is so over the top it would dishonor her, and thereby you, in loving someone dishonored, would also jeopardize sort of your own social standing. Though this might read by, today's standards as like a manipulator's attempt to justify trapping someone in a dangerous relationship, I believe based on the way Love presents its challenge to the narrator, that we're meant to see this as a kind of self-sacrificial act. If you love her, Love says, you must be willing to give up everything, even both of your social reputations. So the protagonist gives his lover the jewels, but she reacts negatively. She throws them to the ground and stomps on them a bunch. And she says, "Teach me to wait. I love you." Now, the phrasing of this is really puzzling, certainly at least in part because the story is over 100 years old. So the beloved, the woman, could be saying, teach me to wait, in the sense of, oh, this is what I get for waiting? You dishonor me? In that case, then what comes next, what love says, sounds more like a correction or a repudiation of her. But if she is saying, teach me to wait, in the sense of, I would rather continue waiting than be dishonored, then what follows from love is more like a piece of friendly advice. In either case, love says to the beloved, if you really do love him, then you'll be willing to wait. And it seems to me that because she rejected the jewels and thus the dishonoring that would have come along with them, love is saying to her, look, it's either this, or if you really love him, you can keep waiting until he can demonstrate that love to you in a way that is more socially acceptable. Whether we read love's response to the lover as a rebuke or as simple instruction, the power dynamics of the situation have sort of shifted a little bit. Both lovers, the guy and the girl, are waiting to be together, but love is now challenging the beloved to wait, whereas it's implied that previously the narrator was the one primarily doing the waiting. I want us to try to imagine why this turn might be frightening from the narrator's point of view. It's implied by love's phrasing at the opening of the story, the if it's true that you love, then wait no longer, that the narrator has been waiting to propose to his beloved, probably for a really long time. Now, however, love has transferred a degree of agency into the hands of the woman in the relationship, challenging her to wait for him to propose. Theoretically, now that the narrator has tried to propose and kind of failed, not fully failed, but low-key sort of failed, what would really stop her from taking a more suitable offer from another man? She says she loves him, sure, but we know from the exaggerated way that she responded to the inappropriate gift of gems that she's growing a little bit impatient. How much longer does the narrator really have before she gives up on him for good? Interestingly, we end the Prophet's Paradise in a place similar to where we began, but with subtle differences. Again, the narrator finds himself waiting for love, trying to convince himself that it'll all work out, probably, if he's just patient. So in his annotated edition of The King in Yellow, Kenneth Haidt makes a really, really strong case that Chambers was a romantic, meaning, among other things, that he probably valued aesthetic beauty and moral goodness very, very highly, and may even have believed in some kind of correlation between the two, that beautiful things were more likely to be morally good, and that morally good things were more likely to be beautiful. But the Romantics, as the name implies, also had certain views about romantic relationships, and it seems to me that those views kind of come to define the core anxieties in The Prophet's Paradise. This piece becomes even more powerful if we remember that Chambers was not just, a romantic, but a romantic writing at the tail end of Romanticism as a dominant cultural and artistic movement, at a time when alternative movements like decadence were rising in cultural dominance. That must have caused him considerable existential anxiety, which I think really comes through in this sequence. To understand this a little bit better, let's talk about the romantic conception of love. Now, a little caveat, the Romantics being a decentralized movement of artists that were active for over a century across all kinds of countries and several different continents, certainly never got together and drafted up a treatise describing what the necessary components of ideal romantic love would be and how one would know when one had attained it. Rather, the list that I'm about to offer is much more descriptive than prescriptive. It's descriptive of trends that I've observed in my own readings of romantic literature, which, as a caveat on top of this caveat, consists mostly of German romantic poets like Goethe, Eichendorff, Schiller, and Kirchhoff. A German-American poet and essayist who was actually a contemporary of Chambers, though I doubt that they were ever exposed to each other's work. So all that to say, these are trends or tropes rather than requirements. The main thing I'll say about the kind of love that was idealized by the Romantics was that to be honest, it's sort of melodramatic. For the Romantics, love was often acute, maybe even all-consuming, In Heinrich Heine's famous Im wunderschönen Monat Mai, or In the Wonderful Month of May, the speaker confesses his feelings for his beloved. It's not like a crazy narrative that occurs, but his love is likened to all the flower buds of spring bursting open, to the sun breaking over the horizon, to all of the birds beginning to sing in a chorus. Though there are examples of a more inward, more quiet love from the Romantics, even these often ache with intense longing that still, to me at least, feels rather loud. Love is also often known in Romantic literature immediately and intensely. This is what we have inherited today as the concept of love at first sight. Love is also pure for the Romantics. There's no infidelity in love, and there are rarely any kept secrets. Lovers are meant to know each other really fully. And finally, true love is supposed to be eternal in the Romantic conception. Lovers are meant to be together in some, celestial sense. And their union should last until death, or even beyond into a Christian or other afterlife. When I studied the German Romantics in undergrad, we were encouraged to steer away from what I'm about to do because it kind of blurs the line between the art and the artist, and it requires one to speculate about things that can't ever really be known. But I think that it'll be useful in this case, so I hope you'll indulge me for just a moment. I want us to imagine that we are true capital R Romantics, that we in our real lives hold to some of the conceptions that I have just listed. Imagine the pressure that these really sort of rigid, sort of grand expectations for how relationships form and what they look like would strain your ability to, court other people. Imagine if you expect of yourself and your partner what I just described. It's expected that you will know each other as your one true loves from the moment that you lay eyes on each other. It's expected that you know each other totally, mind, body, and spirit. It's expected that you basically never express any uncertainty about the future of your relationship, because to suggest that your devotion to each other isn't literally eternal and undying is almost as good as to suggest that it was never even legitimate to begin with. So with that in mind, let me try to summarize the Prophet's Paradise even more concisely, reducing it to what it really is, in my opinion, a sequence of facts about the narrator. Here's what we know. The narrator is an artist who uses art as a kind of replacement for real love and real life experiences. At least one really, really bad relationship-related thing has happened to him in the past, and it's something that he feels compelled to remember, to reflect upon, and yet simultaneously unable to really sit with. He is fearful of becoming just yet another name on the vase of heartbreak, and to have his blood used to water the purity of another relationship, one in which he's not at all involved. The narrator is destined to pass through some gate which others will not be allowed to, and though they are jealous of him for it, he seems mostly disinterested on this unique privilege that he possesses. We also know that in the past, the narrator foolishly believed himself to be the victim of, again, capital T, truth. Specifically, he believed that truth at one point had stolen something from him. From the way that these details are presented in the story, we can conclude that the narrator has since come to the opposite conclusion. He presents himself in this really farcical scenario, so we know that he no longer believes what he did at the time. We also know that the speaker is concerned with loving a woman who is fair and is fixated on true loves that are prevented from blossoming, as we saw in the Jester's story. The narrator believes that true love is worth waiting for, but fears wasting his time and waiting for someone who won't ultimately reciprocate his feelings. And the narrator fears, but is ultimately, to a degree at least, accepting of the fact that even the most beautiful things will one day be subsumed into death. As we start sort of meandering towards a conclusion, I want to emphasize that the Prophet's Paradise is really not the black sheep of The King in Yellow that it initially appears to be on account of its sort of visual form. Its anxieties about romantic love are sort of the dominant thematic undercurrent of the entire collection. Rue Bar, the final story in The King in Yellow, opens with 2 epigraphs. They're really long, so I won't read them both, but I'll put them on screen now. The first is about the inevitability of fate. Some things are just predestined, it argues. The second one, on the other hand, is the power of desire. Naturally, then, the story goes on to put these two concepts into conversation with one another. Which one will win? Predestination or the most acute human desires? In the story, Selby and Foxhall, a pair of friends attending the same Parisian art school, are both attracted to the same woman. A mysterious lady nicknamed Rhubarb, which means road closed in French, an epithet that she earned by refusing the romantic advances of many previous would-be suitors from this same art school. The story is honestly egregiously overlong, but it has its charming moments. And near the end, Rhubarb rejects Foxhall because, she says, she knows what happens to women like her, who are plucked from poverty by rich boys promising the world. Once the passion is gone, she'll be back on the street and probably worse off than she was to begin with. Later, after a night of really heavy drinking, the other friend, Selby, decides to sneak into Rhubarb's apartment through a window. He actually gets lost on his way to her apartment, and by the time that he's perched on the windowsill with the window half open, he's basically sober, but at that point he decides he might as well just see his plan to the end. He goes inside, and despite it being the dead of night, Rhubarb is actually awake and immediately catches him in a really nice comedic moment that I think successfully diffuses a scene that might otherwise read as a little bit predatory. We then get a description of what Selby sees. The room was small and white. Everything was white about it. It did not occur to him to speak. She did not seem to expect it. The whiteness, the extreme purity of everything occupied him, began to trouble him. But almost immediately, a different, more mundane view of the room begins to materialize in front of him. He notices a coal scuttle, a piano, some parchment paper, a curtain covering a pile of dirty laundry, a straw hat, just a random scattering of objects that almost call to mind like a dollhouse. He notices that Rue herself seems different than she always had on the street, less austere, somehow smaller, and almost childlike. They maintain eye contact for a long moment before something inside Selby gives. His lips tightened, and the struggle within him bowed his head and strained every nerve to the breaking. And now it was over, for the voice within had spoken. And the end would always be the same for him. He understood now. Always the same for him. Wordlessly, he then allows Rhubarb to escort him out of the apartment, down the stairs, and out the front door of the building. The story argues that it is Selby's destiny to fall for women who are just not right for him. Women who are unobtainable, not because they are powerful and fae-like as Selby initially assumed Rhubarb was, but because they're too innocent. We could definitely argue that this view of women is very othering and condescending. I mean, Rhubarb is not pure, and she's certainly not a child. She's actually a working woman who clearly has experience with men. But I want to make sure we understand what Chambers is arguing before we get into critiques of it. Like the speaker of the Browning poem quoted in The Mask, Selby's reach will always exceed his grasp. But unlike the speaker of that poem, he's not able to find any peace in accepting that he's always going to be kind of cucked by his own desire. Instead, this destiny depresses him. In part, basically every story in The King in Yellow is about this question of whether the leading man and lady are right for each other. Not just if they'll get together, but whether it is ontologically right for them to be together. In The Mask, the story would have us believe that Genevieve and Alec are meant to be together, but that Boris stands in their way. His death and Genevieve's preservation in stone are thereby ways of bringing that relationship about. Their story is a kind of wish fulfillment that says, in the end, everything works out as it must work out. In Street of the First Shell, another one of the historical drama pieces, the main character, Jack Trent, learns that the woman he thought was his true love has actually already had a child by another man, and worse, that man is a spy just recently caught and about to be executed. Jack freaks out and walks into an active combat zone in what is basically an attempt to sort of end his own life passively, allow something bad to happen vis-a-vis that active combat. But in the end, he actually survives, and he decides to stay true to his girlfriend and to raise the other man's child as his own. The story concludes with another character bursting into the scene and, shocked, asking the question, "Is all well?" This creates some ambiguity as to whether or not Jack actually made the right decision. After all, the love that he's chosen is a far cry from being true in the romantic sense, and is now complicated by the more, material presence of, like, a baby. In The Repairer of Reputations, by showing us what happens when a man rejects all notions of true love and instead adheres to false doctrine, seeks power to a maniacal degree, and receives a creepy simulacrum of sexual pleasure from what the story identifies as unnatural sources, like the sound of armor being worked, Chambers offers a kind of cautionary tale. Rejecting true love, he says, is commensurate with a kind of spiritual decay. So what is the Prophet's Paradise's take on whether or not true love can work out? Personally, I read it pretty pessimistically. The episode titled Destiny tells us that the narrator sees himself as one of the Catholic elect. He is destined to cross the bridge into heaven, which many, many others will be denied. That might sound good because he'll get into Christian heaven, but recall the epigraph. If but the vine and love abjuring band are in the Prophet's paradise to stand, alack, I doubt the Prophet's paradise were empty as the hollow of one's hand. According to the poet, those who get into heaven are not the same as those who have experienced passionate, romantic love. In my reading, the story is like straight up telling us what's going to happen to the narrator here. His name will be inscribed on the jar of heartbreaks, and his blood will be used to water flowers that represent a truer love, one that he himself will never really get to experience. Like Selby, he already seems to know that this is going to be his fate. He's too passive, and when he finally does decide to make a move, it's too dramatic, going in through the window or offering armfuls of jewels as a proposal gift. He waited for the woman, but she won't wait for him, and why would she? She's pure in some spiritual sense. Meanwhile, there's a phantom in his past that he can't even bear to look at, much less come to terms with. If he is to love someone beautiful, it might as well be death, who eventually absorbs all beauty anyways. This is going to be my final video on the canonical King in Yellow stories, and the penultimate video in what I'm thinking of as the first arc of my coverage of the Yellow mythos more broadly. There may or may not even be a second arc, I haven't really decided, but for now it's safe to say that the video that comes after this one, which I'm really excited to share with you guys, details to follow, is going to be the last one for now. With all that in mind, I thought it would be a good idea to close on a story like The Prophet's Paradise, one that lets me offer a summary of what The King in Yellow, the book by Chambers, is really about. In Gothic Things, Jeffrey Andrew Weinstock argues that one of the central concerns of Gothic horror is the question of human agency. Now, we could get into all kinds of arguments about whether The King in Yellow is technically Gothic in the genreic sense, but Weinstock's argument applies either way. The King in Yellow presents a universe in which humans are outmaneuvered by both explicitly evil forces like the King, who wants to lead us into temptation, and by ineffable realities inherent to our nature. By placing these supernatural stories on the same plane as the non-supernatural stories, Chambers is arguing for a kind of equivalence, and if not an equivalence, at least a very strong similarity. Whether it is the King preventing us from finding love, or whether it is us preventing us from finding love, the impossibility remains for certain people. Recall that in The Mask, Alec has basically nothing to do with getting the girl at the end. All of the obstacles in his way really take care of themselves. Likewise, characters who read The King in Yellow throughout the collection, Mr. Scott in The Yellow Sign, Hildred in The Repairer of Reputations, and the unnamed protagonist of In the Court of the Dragon, are already as good as dead. They can make choices en route to that death, but the outcome is really a foregone conclusion. That's why I think The Prophet's Paradise is both maybe the most pessimistic story in The King in Yellow, and the biggest linchpin in understanding what the collection is really capital A about. The narrator in this story is someone who has chosen to wait for love, and if we were to ask him, is all well, it's really obvious that the answer would be no.